27th, 1915. It's a fine, sunny day, and the RMS Lusitania is steaming off the coast of Ireland. She's bound for Liverpool, but she's in a precarious position. The ocean is full of German submarines, the infamous U-boats which have been patrolling Allied ships with devastating efficiency. Lusitania is under the command of Captain William Turner, a veteran of the Cunard line and something of a gruff old sea dog. He's navigated his ship across the Atlantic Ocean and arrived off Ireland as expected, but now he must time his arrival into Liverpool with the tides. Too early an arrival, and Lusitania won't be able to enter the River Mersey. Stopped at the river's mouth, she'd be a sitting duck. Better to stay out at sea and slow her speed so she'll arrive right on time. But Lusitania's greatest defense against German submarines is her speed. Steaming along at around 18 knots compared to her usual 24, Lusitania is still faster than a submerged German U-boat. But then there's a cry from the ship's bow. A torpedo is bearing down on the great Oceanliner, and it's too late to try to get away. Turner's worst fears have come true, and his ship is under attack. Lusitania had received a direct hit just below the bridge. The torpedo had an explosive charge, the equivalent of 162 kilograms or 360 pounds of TNT, and the impact was devastating. Straight away, the ship began to list heavily onto her side and drop by the head. Captain Turner in the bridge ordered an emergency maneuver, an attempted turn towards the Irish coast and a possible beaching, but it was too late. His ship was already in her death throes. And then, just minutes after that, the ship's power had failed and her lights went out. Outside, it's a lovely sunny day. But inside, the ship's cavernous interior has been plunged into blackness. The stage is set for a terrible, epic struggle for survival as hundreds of people are suddenly confronted with the horrifying realities of wartime. They don't have much time, because Lusitania is entering her final plunge. In the wireless room, 20-year-old assistant radio man David McCormick had been at the telegraph when the torpedo hit, and upon feeling the impact under his feet, he and chief radio operator Robert Leith instinctively knew what had happened. Leith, a Liverpudlian, had actually seen Lusitania slip out of Liverpool on her maiden voyage way back in 1907, and now he was responsible for rapidly coordinating a rescue. He had just sat down for lunch when he felt the detonation from below, and he rushed upstairs to the wireless office, and without orders, took over from McCormick and started tapping out an urgent message. "Come at once," he said. "Big list, 10 miles south of the old head of Kinsale." But then the wireless set's power began to falter. The ammeter needle dropped to 0 and the power had died. McCormick fired up the emergency dynamo which ran on battery power, and Leith got back to work again, calling for help. Immediately after the torpedo impact, all across the ship there had been a deep air of confusion, but just minutes later, with the lights dead and the ship's bow plunging into the ocean, panic had begun to take hold. First-class passenger Oliver Percy Bernard had been on deck when the torpedo hit. He is travelling with Leslie Mason, his boss's daughter, and her husband Stuart. Leslie was beside herself with concern because Stuart was nowhere to be seen. Bernard told her to sit tight while he ran below to look for her husband. On his way, he overheard officers ordering people away from the lifeboats as they awaited orders from Captain Turner to abandon ship, but then he was confronted with a horrifying sound. People inside, trapped in elevators, calling for help. The power was out, and there was nothing Bernard could do. He headed for the Mason's cabin, but Stuart was nowhere to be seen. Now, he is rushed back on deck and burst through the entrance, but now Leslie has gone too. He's surrounded by chaos and confusion, and a woman snatches the lifebelt he's carrying from out of his hands. Around Bernard and across the ship, crew begin to work to free and lower the lifeboats. But now, with Lusitania's bow dropping like a stone and the ship at a sharp angle, this is a tougher task than they could have ever imagined. Just days earlier, a half-hearted lifeboat drill had taken place. Lifeboat crews had arrived at their boats, got in, and then simply hopped back out. No attempt at lowering was ever made, but now the crew are faced with the daunting task of lowering the heavy wooden boats against the listing ship. On the port side, Staff Captain James "Jock" Anderson is in charge of lowering the boats. Minutes earlier, women and children had piled in and patiently awaited lowering away, but the list meant the boats were swinging inwards and couldn't be launched. He ordered all the women and children out. In his mind, despite the dramatic list, Lusitania's damage should be contained by the watertight bulkheads and doors. He thinks she is just flooded and her trim is out of whack. He tells the junior third officer to report to the bridge and order that the portside tanks be flooded to straighten her out. He turns to the passengers waiting in front of him and tells them that there is no danger and the ship is not going to sink. On the starboard side, though, it's a very different story. Here, the water is roaring up just feet away, and the rush to escape the ship becomes a desperate fight for survival. The same list which has swung the portside boats in is causing the starboard boats to swing out away from the ship, so deck chairs have to be laid down so that passengers can span the huge gap. Lifeboat 17 is filling up quickly with passengers. Third-class passenger Elizabeth Duckworth has just got her friend Alice Scott's son away in another boat, but there wasn't room for the two women, so they climb instead into boat 17. Nearby, Professor Ian Holborn had befriended 12-year-old Ava's dolphin on the voyage. Now he sees to it that she and two of her travelling companions are put into the same boat. All seems well, but then the crew have trouble with the boat's launching tackle. At the last minute, Elizabeth Duckworth gets spooked. She jumps out of the boat and back onto the deck. Boat 17 lowers away, but just before it reaches the water, it capsizes and spills its entire complement out into the ocean. Many can't swim, and they're dragged down by the weight of their heavy woolen clothes. Up in the wireless room, Leith and McCormick have had to start to brace themselves against the list of the ship. If it gets any worse, Leith will be thrown out of his chair. They realise that there's nothing for it. They'll have to try to make an escape. They burst through the wireless officer's door to find the ship beginning to plunge beneath the ocean. Just outside the office is first-class passenger Oliver Bernard. He couldn't find Leslie Mason nor her husband Stuart, and instead he instinctively has climbed to the upper deck to get away from the confusion and the chaos. McCormick offers Bernard a wooden chair as it may float in the water. It's obvious that soon the men will need all the flotation they can get. "Here's something for you to hang on to, sir," McCormick says. But Bernard politely declines the offer and the chair slides across the deck and crashes into the railing. The whole thing seems surreal. McCormick gets down on hands and knees to take a photograph on his pocket camera. "What a snap this will make," he says. On the port side, Staff Captain Anderson still holds off on lowering the boats. He calls out, "Don't lower the boats! Don't lower the boats! The ship can't sink! Will the gentlemen kindly assist me in getting the women and children out of the boats and off the upper deck?" But as concern begins to mount, his orders are being ignored. Boat 10 is lowering away. It struggles down the ship's hull, bumping and grinding along rivets and plates the whole way before it snags, breaks from its lines, and smashes into the ocean with its full complement of passengers. Survivors come up gasping for air, but then from above, there's another crashing sound. Lifeboat 12 suffers the same fate, but now it and its occupants come crashing down onto the heads of Boat 10's people in the water. Further down the boat deck, a standoff is playing out. First-class passenger Isaac Lehman had made his way to the boat deck, He came across boat 18, sitting idle with about 24 or so nervous passengers on board and a small crowd standing around it. The crew stood around, seemingly equally as nervous, seeing the other boats plummeting down the ship's side. They are reluctant to suffer the same fate and are frozen in indecision. Lusitania is diving downwards quicker and quicker, and Lehman realizes this. He grabs the nearest sailor and shouts, "Why aren't you putting this boat into the water? Who has charge of this lifeboat?" The seaman responds, "It's the captain's orders not to launch any boats." But furious and desperate, knowing the Lusitania is approaching its final moments, Lehman takes out his revolver from his pocket and waves it in plain sight, and he roars his orders. "To hell with the captain," he says. "Don't you see the boat is sinking? And the first man that disobeys my order to launch this boat, I shoot to kill." The sailor is shocked, but he springs into action. He swings his axe to release the pin that's holding the lifeboat in place, but Lehman's rash orders have unintended consequences. The lifeboat swings freely through the air, but the dangerous list of the ship causes it not to go over the side, but to plunge inboard. The hapless crowd of people are standing in its path, and the boat cleaves its way through them and crushes them against the smoking room's deckhouse. Many are badly injured or killed outright, and Lehman himself is caught by the boat's violent motion and his leg is badly smashed. He notices that he's covered in blood, but it may not necessarily be his. Meanwhile, on the starboard side, Boat 3 is loaded with passengers and lowered down. First-class passengers Charles and Mabel Learoyd are travelling with their Australian maid Margaret. Immediately after the torpedo's impact, it had been difficult for Mabel to even climb the ship's first-class staircase, such was the severity of the list. She was then confronted by a horrifying sight, water pouring into the dining saloon, possibly through open portholes. She and her husband found their way to the boat deck, and now, with the ship foundering, they step into Boat 3. It reaches the water, but then, from above, another boat, possibly a collapsible, is lowered right onto their heads. Boat 3 capsizes and throws the Learoyds and the rest of the passengers into the water. Mabel is held underwater for agonizing seconds before she bursts to the surface again, but she has lost sight of her husband. As the great ship sinks behind her, she begins to frantically search, but she will never see him again. Further aft, away from the carnage and despair as the lifeboats are smashed or overturned, theatre manager Charles Frohman is making no effort to save himself. He was heading to Britain to see European play markets and productions, which was a regular exercise for him. He is a humble, quiet man, but a sharp wit and an astute businessman. Playwright and intimate friend Paul Potter had seen him off at the quay as Lusitania was departing. "Aren't you afraid of the U-boats?" he'd asked. Frohman had smiled and simply said, "No, I'm only afraid of the IOUs." Now, with Lusitania dropping beneath his feet, Frohman is standing, chatting with friends by the veranda cafe. He is nonchalant, smoking a cigar, and he's surprised at the attack. "I didn't think they would do it," he says. Rita Jolivet, an actress, joins the group. Frohman tells her to hold onto the railing and save her strength, but as the list beneath his feet gets worse and screams begin to emanate from the crashing lifeboats, the horrifying reality of the situation begins to dawn on them. Frohman cheerfully smiles and paraphrases from his most successful theatre production, Peter Pan. "Why fear death?" he says. "It is the most beautiful adventure." Rita has a terrifying realization. Frohman relies on a cane for mobility. He'll be helpless in the water. Almost prophetically, water begins to surge up the boat deck heading towards them, and Lusitania's end is nigh. Back at Boat 18, the awful results of the crushing incident have to be ignored for now. Injured passengers are bodily heaved in, and the crew somehow get control of the boat and prepare it for lowering. They release the falls, but they do it too quickly. The boat bounces along the ship's hull. "Don't you drop this boat," shouts a man from on board. But then the falls run out, and it drops out of control. Boat 18 slams into the water's surface, spilling everyone inside out and into the ocean. Isaac Lehman had stayed behind, and he grips onto a railing, holding on for dear life, with his crushed foot in some agony. Forward, just astride the second funnel, Lifeboat 7 is being prepared for lowering, but the ocean is roaring up the boat deck, and time has run out. First-class passenger Emilius Laureate is there. He was an experienced transatlantic traveller, a businessman, and this trip had been routine for him. He'd actually got caught inside the ship as the power cut out, but fortunately was able to use his pocket matches to light the way and get out of the pitch-black interior. Now he's at Lifeboat 7, helping load it and prepare it for lowering. He's helping a steward cut away at the falls with a pocket knife to help the lifeboat free, but he has a horrifying realization. A wave has begun to roar up towards them, and towering overhead is one of the monstrous funnels, some 4 stories tall. Laureate stops what he's doing and jumps out, and he pleads for the others to do so. They've run out of time, and there's no chance of getting the boat away. A few get out, but many more stay behind. Laureate jumps into the ocean and looks back to see Boat 7 and its screaming occupants dragged underwater as the ship plunges downward. At the wireless office, Leith, McCormick and Bernard see an opportunity to escape. Boat 11 sits in its davits empty, save for one man hacking away at the ropes with his penknife. An attempt at launching had just been tried, but the boat had capsized and dropped its occupants into the sea. And now the ocean has risen to meet the boat where it sits on the boat deck, and there can be no delay. Leith jumps in to help, and so does Oliver Bernard, who begins to help others in. Water begins to surge up the boat deck and swirl under Boat 11, but by some miracle, the falls are released, and the lifeboat begins to float off the deck. McCormick, meanwhile, stays on the ship. After watching the lifeboats crushed, flipped, or sunk, he wants to take his chances swimming or finding something to hold on to. He dives into the sea, but the camera in his pocket is submerged too, and it ruins the photos that he had taken of the sinking. Those left aboard have begun to instinctively run for higher ground. Lusitania's stern is now rising high out of the water, and her 4 gleaming bronze propellers are pointing towards the sky. Passengers swarm atop the tall second-class deckhouse which rises above the ship's stern. Here, on top, are the lifeboats 21 and 22. 22 is left in place. Lowering against the list of the ship is an impossibility, but 21 is filled and lowered away as the ship's stern swings wildly into the air. Somehow the lifeboat survives its wild flight and gets away as the dying ship begins to slide under for good. Lusitania is 787 feet, or 240 meters long, but the stretch of water she is sinking in is only 93 meters, or 302 feet deep. From far below, there is a deep booming sound and a groan as the great ship's bow, hundreds of feet underwater, strikes the sea floor with a crunch. The bow plates twist and buckle, and the ship's stern begins now to drop like a stone. Slowly, the deck houses and the ornate public rooms are consumed by boiling white water. Aft, at the Veranda Cafe, Rita Jolivet is holding onto the railing and Charles Frohman when the surging ocean rises to meet her. Rita goes on to describe it as a green cliff of water. The group is separated, and Rita is pulled down violently, so violently that her tightly laced boots are simply pulled from right off her feet. She rises up, but she's pulled under again by the suction, and this happens a few more times. The story is the same for Isaac Lehman. He was clinging onto the railing, his foot a damaged mess, when the seawater roared over the deckhouse behind him and pulled him under. But somehow he and Rita both come up to the surface for good, and they watch in awe as Lusitania's stern drops straight down. Charles Laureate had narrowly escaped being pulled down by Lifeboat 7, but now there is another danger headed his way. The wireless antenna, strung between the ship's masts and usually 180 feet or 55 meters clear above the waterline, now slaps down into the ocean around him. Some others are hit by the heavy steel cables, and Laureate feels it clip his shoulder and spin him upside down. He struggles for his life and breaks free, bursting to the surface again, and he swims frantically for a lifeboat. Laureate isn't the only one hit by debris or parts of the ship as she goes down. Lifeboat 15's launch had been left to the absolute last second. The boat was washed bodily across the boat deck and straight into the support cables for funnel number 3. As the ship sank around them, the huge funnel loomed overhead, and many in the boat thought it was going to crush them. A few jumped into the water to swim away, but then, at the last second, Lusitania seemed to roll away, and Boat 15 was freed. But now, just seconds later, as those funnels are dragged below the surface, still attached to the ship, their huge tops are pulled below, but they are empty inside, and they create a huge suction. Those who had jumped out of Boat 15, and any others unfortunate enough to be close nearby, are pulled under by a maelstrom into the funnel tops and dragged below. 26-year-old Margaret Guire is one of those pulled down. She is dragged below and thinks the end is here. But then, at the last second, a huge pocket of hot air bursts from deep below the ship and blasts her and 2 other passengers nearby to the surface, covered in soot. Lusitania's lifeboats had presented a deadly chaos. Ironically, those who stayed behind at the ship's stern now have the gentlest escape. They simply step off and into the water as it rises around them. The second-class deckhouse tower is engulfed, and then the ship's fantail or her very stern drops. And as it does, Lifeboat 21 on the port side is picked up by the water and breaks free from its lines upside down. Swimming passengers rush to climb on top, and within seconds, Lusitania has disappeared from sight, and the grand old Cunard liner is gone. In her place are hundreds of people struggling in the water, in between bodies and debris. Lusitania had been carrying 22 full-size wooden lifeboats and 48 rafts and collapsible boats of various kinds. But in the end, only 6 lifeboats were successfully launched. And all of these were on the starboard side. On the port side, one boat was successfully lowered, but the plug wasn't installed, so it was swamped. Rita Jolivet is pulled from the water into a lifeboat, and she survives, but Charles Frohman doesn't make it. Wireless operator David McCormick survives the sinking. He climbs onto the side of a collapsible lifeboat, and he too is pulled from the water alive later in the afternoon. Staff Captain Anderson had refused to believe that the ship was sinking, but he was wrong, and he was lost in the disaster. However, Captain William Turner stays on the ship's bridge as it sinks from under him, and he is rescued from the water alive. Lusitania sank in just 18 minutes, only 11 miles or 20 kilometers from shore. 1,959 people had been aboard, and there are only 761 survivors. The experience was traumatic and profound for those who had survived. In 1935, Rita Jolivet was giving an interview, and when asked to reflect on Lusitania, she simply said, "How do you imagine it changed me? No, you cannot imagine. And I cannot tell you how much it changed me. There are not words."